All right. What's the best way to get to Miami?
Go south.
Go south. All right. So you're saying get a compass out,
Yeah.
and start walking south, and I'll get to Miami.
Eventually.
Eventually?
Yeah.
I thought, doesn't the state kind
Due
of
south?
curve a little? I mean, wouldn't I get in like the Everglades if I just went due
Go
south?
southeast.
Go southeast. But if I go
And
too
you go to the
southeast, won't I hit the Atlantic well
That's
north?
when you stop.
That's when I stop. But you're saying the best way to
When your
get
feet get wet, you veer south.
okay. When your feet get wet, turn south.
You're walking.
I'm in Florida. My feet are gonna get wet 15 feet from this building. But so you're saying that I should walk?
No.
I shouldn't walk?
Take the turnpike.
Take the turn. I should walk on the turnpike.
No, I didn't say that. I said take the turnpike.
Take the turnpike. So why should I walk? Or why should I drive rather than walk?
Because it's a lot easier on the body.
Okay. So it's
And time-wise, it's more efficient.
it's certainly, I would imagine, a little quicker than walking, especially in September in Florida.
Yeah.
The sisterhood bus.
The Sisterhood bus. Thank you for the commercial. Right, take the Sisterhood bus that goes down every autumn.
How about train? Take the train. Doesn't the train?
Not easily.
No, it's hard.
Oh.
Yeah, you're in the wrong country for taking the train.
They don't run on time.
Madeline Kavanaugh took the train. She took the train down from here to there. And she said it was the best. Sometimes the train would stop for no apparent reason.
Yeah.
But then it would
Well,
go.
they're
right.
those little trains are
Yeah.
far.
Exactly. They were the bandits. They had to.
Bandits.
Nobody flies to.
I was gonna say.
Yeah.
I have done that.
Yes. I mean, that's probably even faster than driving, isn't it?
Not really.
Or it depends on
Nowadays, you have to go 2 hours before.
depends how long through security.
Right.
And if you have checked bags, then you got to wait at
And
the
then you
luggage.
have to drive to the airport, and then you have to have someone pick you up.
You're talking
Ah.
about people whose husbands prefer to drive.
Ah,
Wherever we go. So
Why go to Miami?
why go to Miami? Okay, so trying to find the right way often involves figuring out which way you want to go in the first place. And once you figured out where you want to go, then you have to figure out how to get there. And we're going to get a little bit of that in this week's Torah portion. And we're also going to get a lot of which way you don't want to go in this week's Torah portion. We're only going to look at a tiny slice together, as is our usual shita, our usual pattern. But I do recommend that you read, of course, the whole Torah portion for the week if you haven't already done stuff. But keep that in mind. Where do you want to go, and how do you get there? As we're reading our section for this afternoon. Okay? Okay, so we are in Parashat Tavo, and we are going to pick up on chapter 28, which is page 1148. And we're going to start from verse 1 of that chapter. So we're in 1148, Tavo. Sound good?
Mm-hmm.
Sound good. I need a volunteer to allow me to interrupt them.
Ready?
Yep.
Okay. Now, if you obey the Lord your God to observe faithfully all his commandments, which I enjoin upon you this day, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. All these blessings shall come upon you and take effect, and if you will, but heed the word of the Lord your God. Blessed shall you be in the city, and blessed shall you be in the country. Blessed shall be the issue of your womb, and the produce of your soil, and the offspring of your cattle, and the calving of your herd, and the lambing of your flock. Blessed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Blessed shall you be in your comings, and blessed shall you be in your goings. The Lord will put to rout before you the enemies who attack you. They will march out against you by a single road, but flee from you by many roads. The Lord will ordain blessings for you upon your barns and upon all your undertakings. And he will bless you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you.
All right, pause there. So what do we want? Where do we want to go? What are we looking for?
Blessings.
Blessings. Okay, so we want some blessings. And what form are those blessings taking?
Just about every form.
Just about everything. So give me some examples. That means you can't be wrong if it's everything.
You'll be blessed.
All right, so we want to have children.
Possessions.
Children.
Children,
I'm going to write the word stuff for possessions because it's shorter. Crops, right?
Crops.
So I'm going to put food a little bit more generally.
because it carries your cattle, the calving of your herd.
Our flocks and animals, good.
Your basket and your kneading bowl, which means wheat and fields and all of that.
Comings and goings.
In and out. Not the burgers, but the comings and goings. Protection. All right, let's add in. We got a very important thing here about war and safety. Very good.
And no matter where you are,
And what?
wherever you are.
And all of this is universal, right? So we are looking for this destination, a life of blessing in all of these kinds of ways, everywhere we are. That's a pretty good destination, right? Better than Miami. Don't take that personally, anyone here who's from Miami, but that pretty much trumps Miami. That's a good destination. How do we get there? Well, how does the Torah tell us we're getting there in this section?
Obeying God.
All right, so we get this phrase that's repeated in a couple different ways. Obey, right? If you obey, then everything happens. Very simple, right? Lesson over, we're done. Just go home, obey, blessings come.
And
One more line.
the Lord will establish you as his holy people, as he swore to you, if you keep the commandments of the Lord your God and walk in his ways.
Actually, read one more as well.
And all the peoples of the earth shall see that the Lord's name is proclaimed over you, and they shall stand in fear of you.
Okay, and then we get a few more ideas of some of the blessings and things that will happen that are good. All right, so verse 9, we need to keep the commandments of the Lord, right? And keep is sort of a synonym for obey. And we need to walk in God's ways.
That means action.
What does walk in God's ways mean?
Obey his commandments.
So it's another synonym for obedience.
Mm-hmm.
Yes?
Imitate God's attributes.
Imitates God's attributes. So I need to be more godly.
You need to
For perfection.
Strive for perfection.
It's an action.
But it seems, I mean, well, it's action, but you see, there's a problem here. We're talking about this destination of everything you could ever ask for, right? The ultimate reward from the game show is right there. And they go to explain the rules of the game. And the rules of the game says, all you have to do is obey and walk in God's ways. And we go, okay, obey, I can sort of figure out. Walk in God's ways. Is that a separate rule? Or is that a restatement of the first rule? Because if you get it wrong, you don't get there. Right? When you try to give me directions to get to Florida, if you get the directions wrong, I end up with alligators in the Everglades or surfing in the Atlantic. Or run over on the turnpike, which is perhaps even more likely. I need directions that will get me to my destination. And I need unambiguous directions, or at least I need directions that have been disambiguated. The ambiguity taken away. We want to get rid of the ambiguity.
Okay.
Yeah. That was a deliberate word to reinforce the idea of how silly this can sound. Wow, we got a good turnout today. I hope I have enough copies. If you find yourself needing to share, share. You got to remember, Paul, people always take up multiple chairs whenever they come to synagogue. It's why sanctuaries always need twice as many seating spots as people who are going to come, because you need an extra spot for your talit and for your bag and for the chumash when you're not using it. And
As do I.
Yeah.
So,
exactly, everyone does. It's part of being in the place. Okay, how do we do? Got it? Got enough copies at least with a little sharing? Not too bad? Okay. Back to our designated reader.
What am I reading?
What does this mean? You're reading from the handout. Top line.
To mimic his good and straight ways, as it is stated, and walk in his ways.
So this is our quote from Deuteronomy, right? To walk in his ways. What does that mean? According to Rambam, this is a mitzvah unto itself. Right? This is not saying obey all the other mitzvahs. It's saying walk in God's ways is its own mitzvah. And it means to mimic God's good and straight ways. Doesn't that clear it all up? Hand.
No, I was just thinking, Micah reduced, that whole thing of reducing
Mm-hmm.
the Torah to 3, which was do justice, love mercy, and walk
Humbly with God. And that's the thing, we get the phrase walking with God
Yeah.
over and over again throughout the
Yeah.
Tanakh.
But we don't.
And what Rambam is trying to say here is that is its own mitzvah. It doesn't just mean doing all the other mitzvahs well.
It's actually.
But unfortunately, in this particular part, he goes on to more detail, as do other commentators, we don't know what the details of that mitzvah are. Mimic God's good and straight ways. That's kind of hard to start with. That was sort of like when you guys told me walk south. I can sort of pick the direction out of the horizon, but that may not get me where I want to go. So let's try another attempt at what this means to walk in God's ways. So this forenote.
You are not to seek out new paths, which the prophet or dreamer employs to make you depart from the ways of the Lord.
All right, that's a little more straightforward, yes. Right, walking in God's ways. Maybe Forno is trying to say it's not such a whole separate category of action. It just means only walk in God's ways. Don't let some dreamer or prophet come and tell you about, I found this new road. You know, that's,
stay off the back road.
stay off the back
Stay on
roads.
the turn.
The turnpike is the way to the south. You want to stay on the turnpike. I don't care if it looks like there's a neat little fruit stand just over the hill there, and you're going to go pick up some oranges. Stay on the turnpike, because once you get off the turnpike, you're not going to get back on. Right? How many? I have to say, when I came east, it was the first time in my life I finally found freeways or turnpikes or all the other weird words for big roads out here that we call freeways in California, that had off ramps with no on ramp on that same exit. I grew up in California where if there was an off ramp from the road, there would be an on ramp right on the other side, and if you picked the wrong off ramp, it was okay. You just got back on and you were sailing. And here and up in Maryland as well, you'd get off and you go, missed it. How do I get back? How do I get back on the road? And
You have another adventure.
you have another adventure, and
Unless
that's
you have
and that's what's
flat tires in Los Banos.
and that's what Forno is saying, right? Is you have to stay on the right path. That's what it means to walk in God's ways. It means don't pick other ways to get to God. God has given us a way. We call it Torah. Stick with it, and you'll be safe. It's the Rand McNally travel guide. Right? Don't get some hand-drawn map from your brother-in-law. Okay. On the other hand, Midrash Hagadol says,
Being a holy nation refers to the holiness from its vote. Every time the Holy One gives the people of Israel more mitzvot, God gives them more holiness.
right, this whole notion at the beginning of verse 9, the Lord has established you as a holy people and walk in God's ways. What he's trying to say is that the mitzvot work together with holiness. Right? As we say, Asher Kiddishanu, that God has sanctified us, the mitzvotav, through the mitzvot. And therefore, walking in God's ways leads to holiness. And that's what we mean. Mitzvot, holiness, that's what we're talking about here. So how are we doing so far? Anybody convinced by Sforno that walking in God's ways means just stick with God and don't listen to some other random dream or prophet? Someone thinks Midrash Hagadol has it better. it's all about the holiness through the mitzvot. That's what it means to be in God's ways. Or is Rambam right that this is a whole separate entire mitzvah by itself, which has unique ramifications that we just haven't uncovered?
I like Rambo.
You
I do.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and pursue and see if we can get any other alternative interpretations. Tanchuma.
When Moses said to the people, after the Lord your God shall you walk, Deuteronomy 13, they took alarm at the formidable, or rather impossible, task imposed upon them. How is it possible for human to
Sorry,
walk?
that should be a human.
Yeah, okay, for a human to walk after God, whose way is in the storm and in the whirlwind, and the clouds are the dust of God's feet. Not one. Whose way is in the sea and his path in the great waters, from the Psalms.
Right, so notice the problem. This is on the same topic, but taken from an earlier section of Devarim. Walk after God. I can't play follow the leader with God, right? Because God is in the whirlwind. God is in the storm. God is across the seas and the oceans. I can't walk there. It'd be the equivalent of you telling me to fly to Miami, and I'd say I don't have wings. I'd say, how can I follow God and walk in his ways when God's ways are not my ways? Because I'm not God. Good question, right? People are rightfully confused by this. And Moses tries to explain them.
Moses explained to them that to walk after God meant to imitate humbly his attributes of mercy and compassion by clothing the naked, visiting the sick, and comforting the mourner.
Okay, so what does walking after God's ways mean then? Just give it back to me, in your own words.
Doing certain mitzvot.
Doing certain mitzvot.
That are related to people more so than prayer ritual.
More than prayer and ritual, but how does that relate to walking in God's ways then? I mean, all the mitzvahs are mitzvahs, right? All the mitzvahs are commandments. Well, how is this God's ways, the path God walks to specifically clothe the naked, visit the sick, comfort the mourner?
Well, it looks to me as though they sort of, in this separated God the Creator, or the whirlwind and whatever, that's not us,
Right?
and God the still small voice,
Mm-hmm.
which is us, conscience and doing, not only for people, but presumably the environment and the flocks and whatevers and so forth. And I think it's simply saying you can walk in God's ways by tending to those things that are possible for you to do in a sensitive way.
So walking in
Not
God's
concern yourself about whether the sun's going to come up tomorrow morning, because that's not in our purview.
right. So walking in God's ways doesn't mean you have to be God. Doesn't mean you have to create the universe. It doesn't mean you have to maintain the universe. But on those things where we've seen God act that are imitatable by humans, imitate. And that might go back to our idea that Rambam is saying to mimic God's good and straight ways, that we are meant to emulate God's actions. And the Talmud in Sota is going to give us more detail on these ones that we just read. So let's go ahead and get a little expanded version of what it means to clothe the naked, visit the sick, and comfort the mourner, and how that actually is something God has done.
Just as God clothes the naked, as it is written, and the Lord God made for Adam and for his wife coats of skin and clothed them, so shall you clothe the naked. Just as the Holy One visited the sick, as it is written, and the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of
Mamre, and that's referring to Abraham just after his circumcision, right? So God shows up while he's recovering. That's Bikur Cholim. That's visiting the sick.
So shall you visit the sick, as he comforted the mourners, as it is written, and it shall come to pass after the death of Abraham that God blessed Isaac his son. So shall you comfort the mourners. And he buried the dead, as it is written, and he buried him in the valley. So shall you bury the dead.
Right, and who is buried in the final one there? Moses, right? So we start off with the act of clothing the naked of Adam and Eve, and we end the Torah with the act of God burying the dead. And in between, God does other things for people in need. Right? He visits the sick and he comforts those who are bereaved. And if God did that, we should do that. Make sense? Maybe? But aren't those just what we call mitzvahs? I mean, God told us to visit the sick. God told us to comfort those that were mourning. God told us to clothe the naked and to bury the dead in other places as independent mitzvot. How are these somehow separate into their own little category of walking in God's ways?
Well, perhaps, and while this wouldn't be the only items on the list, the fact that all of these speak to that if they are done, it establishes a certain type of community and a certain type of atmosphere and ambiance within the community.
Absolutely. The cumulative effect of taking care of those in need, whether they be sick, mourning, naked, or dying, creates a particular type of community. Absolutely. But many other mitzvot do as well. The honesty in business is a very important mitzvah for creating the right sort of atmosphere. The return of lost property is a very important mitzvah for creating the right kind of trust within the community. These seem to be singled out.
Are these the mitzvot we see God doing?
Yes.
And the others are mitzvot. We don't see God keeping kosher.
Correct.
We don't see God, doing other mitzvot.
You don't see God keeping one set of weights for his cart in the market in order to sell his grapes.
Or not, and the weight distribution on
Right.
it. I mean, so
Right.
these are the things.
Right. The sages went through the Torah and they found God performing some mitzvot. Not all of them, because most of the mitzvot are for us.
Right.
But there are some that God's actions imitate our mitzvahs, which is a little surprising. And that's what the rabbis are picking up on. And they're saying walking in God's ways is somehow connected to imitating God's performance of mitzvot, which imitate mitzvot that we are commanded to do.
He's modeling, demonstrating how to do it.
But he's demonstrating these. And that's what's so unusual.
These are vulnerable.
These are all vulnerable people. These are people who are in desperate need. And God has gone out of his way, if there is such a thing, to deliberately model, to be a dugma with these particular cases and without others. And that got the rabbis' attention. And that's why they said this is very important to learn, very important to study. That walking in God's ways is not just obey, because we're always commanded to obey the mitzvot. That there's something special about walking in God's ways that's triggering a deeper understanding of God and our world that needs attention. And they point that out in our sorry, go ahead.
Oh.
I don't want to cut you off if you have another comment, but then we're going to look at the last paragraph on that page.
Okay. Is it your desire to know the one who spoke and the world came into being?
Is it your desire to know the one who spoke and the world came into being?
Study about God. For through doing so, you will come to know that the one who spoke and the world came into being and will cleave to God's ways.
All right, so first of all, you might want to remind yourself if you're here earlier during services, either on Sunday Minyan or at the Academy Minyan or Shabbat services. Baruch she'amar v'haya ha'olam, right? Blessed is the one who spoke and the world came into being. That's the reference that's being used here. And they're saying, do you want to know God? Do you want to know God? If you want to know God, that one who spoke and the world came into being, if you want to know that God, you can't just study halakha. You can't just study the laws. You also have to study the Agadah, which is the philosophical, the theological, the moral, the ethical that goes beyond the law. if you want to really know God, you have to go above and beyond obedience. You have to try to understand. And that means you're studying Agadah, which is a different category of debate, discussion, philosophy. It's something we've done a lot in this class, but it's a whole category by itself. Halacha is very important for understanding our obligations and how to obey the law. Agadah is very important for understanding why and how this fits together within the entire universe. And if you want to get to God, you can't just obey. You have to understand. And that is a whole another level of commitment. All right, so let's talk about how we can begin to reflect this. You didn't know you were signing up for a lifetime job of reading, did you? You thought it was just a couple little paragraphs.
Yeah, right.
All right, so this is from Mishnah Torah. This is from Rambam, from Hilchot Deot, from the first section of his great law code. Rambam inserted this whole discussion. And do digest that for a moment, that in the great law code that Rambam wrote, he took an awful lot of time right up at the start to talk about these ideas. Right? He didn't just talk about this is the way you keep kosher, this is the way you keep Shabbat, this is the way you're honest in business. He added in these topics about walking in God's ways and what that really, really means. Okay, first paragraph.
One who is carefully self-reflecting, and who thus moves oneself from one's norm toward one side or the other. This one is called pious. For instance, one who moves oneself away from proud heartedness.
From arrogance.
Thank you. Toward the opposite side and attains a lowly spirit he is called pious. And his is the
Midah.
of piety.
Right, so midah is the Hebrew word for a character or attribute, right? It's the characteristic or attribute, the quality of a particular thing. So if what Rambam is saying here, and I'm going to erase our little illustration, such as it was, right? If you are here and you try to move your quality, the nature of your character towards this way, and you're trying to really push it, we call that pious, right? Because you are really pushing to an extreme in a particular way. And the example he gives is that if you are trying to push yourself away from being arrogant towards being absolutely humble, absolutely lowly. Sorry, absolutely low. I'm going to keep this because humble's coming in the sentence. Absolutely lowly, right? Let's call this over here. See if I can make this a little bit clearer. Arrogant, and this over here is lowly. If you'd really try to reach for the extreme away from arrogance, we call that pious. Right? And everyone's going, oh, well, that sounds nice. Yes, being pious is lowly. But Rambam goes on.
But if he moves himself only toward the middle and becomes humble, he is called wise. And his is the midah of wisdom.
So if you push your character, your midah, towards being humble, we call you wise. If you push yourself to the opposite extreme of arrogant, we call you pious.
But you may not be wise.
Which is better.
I mean, do you accumulate?
Right, is
Or
it
do you as you go through?
Right? Well, I mean,
But yeah, does your arrow start in arrogant or start in humble?
it actually doesn't matter. Right? Because this is, I'm going to go ahead and see if my art skills can do this. The question is, where is your target? If your target is here, we call you pious. If your target is here, we call you wise. Now, if you're here, this is going to be a lot easier than that. But even if you're naturally inclined to be here, the definitions still count.
So you can set yourself.
You could be lowly by nature and decide to be a little bit more proud.
But still be humble.
Well, that's what humble is in Judaism, right? Humble is not self-effacing in Judaism. Humble is a proper analysis and understanding of your own self-worth. And that doesn't mean you're worthless. That's lowly.
Oh, that's Penelope.
I'm going to say, if Penelope's telling me that the audio is not working, no, we're okay. And I do apologize for leaving that on, but because the technology is a little spotty at times, it's helpful, and she will let me know if it's not working. Lowly means you think you're worthless. Humble means you think you're worth what you're actually worth. And arrogant is you think you're worth more than you're actually worth. Right? That's the continuum. And some people are naturally more prone to being lowly than they are to being arrogant. They usually don't go into politics. But the question Rambam is working with here is, where should my target be? And he's describing, yes, if you go for the lowly, that's a pious path. But if you go for humble, that's to say that 100% accurate understanding of who you are and what your capabilities are, and you're not being more than you are, and you're not saying you're less than you are, we call that being wise. And which is better?
Are we able as individuals to really judge whether we're humble or lowly or?
Well, we're not able to necessarily jumble words. We're not necessarily able to judge accurately ourselves, but we are able to accurately figure out what our target should be. Right? So I can figure out that what I want to be is honest with myself. The reason there are rings on targets is because hitting the bullseye is hard. But at least if I know where that target is, my shots are going to be around the bullseye somewhere. So I may not be perfect at being humble. I have to modestly admit I'm not perfect at being humble. Or I may not be perfect at achieving the ultimate state of lowliness of my spirit, but I will get a very different result if I'm aiming here than if I'm aiming here. And I'll certainly get a very different result than if I'm not aiming at all, and people tend to slide on that end.
It's definition then.
It's definition, and it's target, right? Remember, it's like when I asked you at the very beginning, how do I get to Miami? Right? If I ask you how to get to Miami, you're going to give me a very different set of directions than if I ask you how can I get to Tallahassee. But I may not get to Miami perfectly or Tallahassee perfectly, but I will head in very different directions if you know what my target is.
And if you're wise, you'll stay in Orlando.
I'm working on it. Barbara, did you want to add more to that?
Yes, I'll tell you, I'm concerned about this pious, lowly status.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed to me,
You're not the only one, by the way.
all right, it seemed to me, of course, we have all of these metaphors that we use. For example, we are created in the image of God.
Mm-hmm.
If we as humans are created in the image of God, to aspire toward this total lowly, self-effacing, or whatever it implies, negates the dignity that ought to come with a view toward we are better than that. How we're better than that, I imagine, would be an individual matter. But how one would purposely say, oh, you know, I want to be pious, I'm going to be a nothing, I'm going to be a rag for people to walk on. Why is this an aspiration? What's so desirable about it? I don't know. It seems to me to have a realistic view of either your good points, your bad points, what you can do, what you can't do. Maybe try to be better. If that falls in the category of wisdom, I would opt for that. And I don't know why I'd want to move the needle anywhere past that, personally.
Excellent, yes.
Rambam is saying that one arrogant or lowly is good.
Correct.
He's much involved in the golden mean.
Well, he is hinting, and we're going to get this in more detail in just a second, as soon as I let our reader continue. He is hinting by the use of the term wise, which for Rambam is the ultimate adjective, that this is the proper target. What he's also saying, however, is that for some people, they have difficulty hitting this without going there. And they will often have to overcompensate in order, it's sort of like shooting into the wind, right? If I want to hit here, if the wind is blowing me this way, because I'm more naturally inclined towards arrogance, I'm going to have to shoot here so that the arrow will be blown back on course and I'll end up here. So for some people, Rambam is arguing they do need to push themselves towards excessive piety, which means lowliness, because it will balance out their natural tendency in the opposite direction and they'll end where they should be. But really the ideal is to aim for the center and to hit the center.
I mean, there is a correlate to this in terms of, I know I've been with folks who will say, part of an organization, I do much better just being part of a committee and doing the work. When I'm put in charge, I get a little weird and it's just not good for me or anybody else.
Right. And that's deliberately shooting to the right of humble, because your capabilities are fine, but there's something about the psychology, the personality, or whatever, that under certain circumstances, you'll shoot this if given a chance.
Right.
So you err on the side of, I don't think it's best to put me in charge.
Right.
And a person has to know themselves very well to know how to aim. But what Rambam is trying to say is that regardless of how you're aiming, really ultimately this should be the shot, and we're going to continue reading in order to make sure we can get through the text.
This is so with all the rest of the midot.
Right. So for any of the other proper characteristics of a person, right? One's temper, one's passions, one's sense of pleasure. The idea is that wisdom is there in the middle. Keep going.
The early pious ones would incline their dispositions from the middle of the scale toward one of the two extremes. Someone inclined toward the first extreme, and the others would incline toward the other. This is going beyond what the law requires. We are commanded to walk in these intermediate paths, which are good and straight, as it says, walk in his ways.
Right. So where's God on the scale? Where's God's ways?
In the middle.
In the middle. This is God's ways. We might be inclined to think that going to the extreme, the opposite of the what we like least as a negative emotion, is being in God's ways, right? Because you're being perfect by being infinitely opposed to what we dislike most. But what Rambam is saying is that no, lowly is a negative just as much as arrogance is a negative.
But pious doesn't sound negative.
Well, it doesn't, and pious isn't as negative, because what Rambam is trying to say is that yes, for some people of unique disposition and character, they will struggle to hit the middle mark, and they do have to overcompensate. But that's not the norm, right? And the norm of overcompensating, not the norm, the O's you must overcompensate. It's like bent, springy metal, right? If you've ever seen a bar that's been bent, right? If you want to get it bent back to the middle, what do you have to do? Heat it. Without a torch, you bend it past the middle, and when you let go, it comes back to that middle point, right? Because something that's bent here, you have to bend it past the middle for it to come back straight. Right? Most metal that has a little spring in it is like that. Right? You have to overbend so that when you let go of the pressure, it will come back to the center. If you just bend it to the middle, right? If you have the metal that's bent here and you bend it to the middle, when you let go, it'll come back, halfway or a third towards the wrong side again. You have to over adjust so that when you let go, the spring pulls it back to the middle instead. And that's what Rambam is trying to say here, that yes, some people have to go above and beyond in one direction or the other. And he does argue in much more detail in the full version of this, which I always say, I highly recommend people read the full versions. He does argue that some people even have to go this way. Some people are so naturally lowly that they have to overcompensate by puffing themselves up a little bit so that they will end up on the humble mark rather than in the gutter. It's just that in the modern world, we tend to see lowliness as being a unmitigated virtue and arrogance as being the vice. And Rambam is saying, no, the proper path is in the middle. Thought I saw a hand, yeah. One, two.
Influence, and I know many times people were, when people went pious to the extremes, they went to hair shirts and whipping themselves, all kinds of
laying naked in the
primitive,
snow, and yeah.
living off in caves and all kinds of really bizarre things that Judaism was pulling always, don't go there.
Right. So there is a danger
There is
in terms of, if this is best and this is worst, there is a real danger because lowly and arrogant can both be among the worst. Right? It's not just best is here and worst is here. Best is the perfect balance, and worst is an absolute imbalance.
It isn't just feeling lowly,
Right.
it's feeling
Because then you
the
just,
arrogance of,
I'm going to push myself lower and lower and lower and lower. You're not doing anyone a favor.
Look who thinks he's nothing.
Look, one of my favorite jokes. Look who thinks he's nothing. And to be fair, there is also in many
You
cases.
almost had to be Jewish.
Yeah. Absolutely. Sometimes there is a certain arrogance to lowliness. There are people who take pride in how lowly they act, and that has its own problem.
The operative word, act.
Yes, rather than necessarily truly feel. Yes. All right. One more comment, or
I was just curious if the sages then, in general, would wind up around wise.
we hope.
Okay.
We hope, and there are specific stories about different sages that have challenges, not just on this spectrum, but on many other character trait spectrums that had to overcompensate one way or the other. But the aim was always that middle. All right, so we're going to get a little bit more detail about the sages in their
have
interpretation.
the following interpretation of this commandment. Just as God is called gracious, you too must be gracious. Just as God is called compassionate, you too must be compassionate. Just as God is called holy, you too must be holy. As such, the prophets called God by many appellations.
Yeah, that's not a mountain range, that means names.
Okay. Slow to anger, abundant in graciousness, just and fair, pure, mighty, and powerful. In order to demonstrate that these are good and proper ways for a person to accustom oneself to act in imitation of God to the utmost of one's ability.
All right, so he's giving a little bit more of a depth, this idea of walking in God's ways. Right, walking in God's ways, we have that example, specifically of God performing these imitatable acts of visiting the sick, clothing the naked, helping the poor, and all of these are there as part of the act of understanding the proper way to act in all situations. Right, those particular acts are very difficult for many people to truly embrace and understand why they are doing them. Right? When you are clothing the naked, helping somebody that is poor to have enough to wear, this balance is very easily thrown off. It's very easy to either feel great about yourself because you're not the one looking for a handout of clothes, or to feel great about yourself because you're helping them. Or it's often possible, although less common, I think, in average, for a person to feel so sympathetic with a person in need that they degrade themselves in the process of, oh, I should have done more, I should be more sympathetic, I should help more, I am worthless because I have not clothed all of the people in the world and have not fulfilled the commandment of helping everyone. Or just how can we live in a world we are such worthless a community because such things happen? They're problems. And visiting somebody that is sick, as anybody here who has taken on that mitzvah seriously knows, is very difficult to come in and have the right balance of both cheer as well as compassion, and to keep yourself hopeful, but also not to ignore the real difficulty the person is going through. That's a very difficult balance to perform, and so too with comforting the mourners, and with where was I in the list? Comforting the mourners, visiting the sick, clothing the naked, and burying the dead. Okay, those are tough ones, and God carries them out with, shall I say, perfection. And the idea is,
when people feel very alone
and confused and emotionally conflicted. And this is saying
And you're still.
you walk in God's ways, right? Do it as God did. Now, there's a problem with this type of language, though. Those of you who have come to my Understanding God class may hear some echoes of this from previous sessions, which is God slow to anger? We use that title for God, and we say we should imitate God and also be slow to anger. Does God get angry? Does God, who is abundant in graciousness, does that mean I too am abundant in graciousness? Yes. Does that mean God really is gracious sometimes and sometimes not? The adjectives get a little slippery. So we're going to do, in honor of the month of Elul, this month of tshuva, of returning and trying to understand our place and importance in the world, we're going to just wrap it up, I hope, with a little bit more on that particular nuance and how it matters spiritually to us, not just metaphysically for understanding God.
God is above every great characteristic of excellence. For we have neither the power nor the knowledge to comprehend the greatness of God's exalted level and the abundance of God's goodness, nor do any beings that have been created. And the prophets would call God by all the names and the attributes such as forbearing, anger, perish the thought.
Forbearing from anger, comma.
Perish the thought that anger is ever before God.
All right, so let's make sure that we understand this before we get into a really interesting analysis of anger. What he's saying is, God's ways and the middle way, when we call this the fulfillment of the mitzvah of walking in God's ways, there is a hard distinction between what we do and what God does. And that distinction is God doesn't really fit into our adjectives, our reality, our world that we can describe and understand. All we know is that what God does, if done by a human, is marked as wise, is marked as gracious, is marked as loving. But that doesn't mean God is defined by those characteristics. It's simply how those characteristics appear to us in this world. God is wholly different. So when we say God is slow to anger, that doesn't mean God gets angry slowly. It means if God were a human, we would say, man, that guy has a long temper, right? He's hard to set off. And I know that depending upon how you read the Bible, that may seem surprising. We're going to see in a minute why it's not. But that doesn't mean God actually has anger issues at all. God never gets angry. The description, slow to anger, is there to teach us the middle path, not to teach us about God. Because God is beyond anger and these other attributes as well. So let's explain why God is beyond anger in the next paragraph. Or not the next paragraph, next sentence in that paragraph.
Start with since.
Since, yes.
Since it lies within God's power to bring death and give life, to eradicate a world and create a new one, and there is none to tell God what to do, why should he grow angry?
Right? Think for a second. Why do people get angry? Frustration, right? You want to do something and you can't, or you don't want to do something and you have to. Something has happened in the world that has really disappointed you, upset you. It's just not fair. If only you were in charge, you would do things differently. Most of the causes of anger have to do with our powerlessness. No? Is there anything in the world that God can't do?
What do we do in the flood?
What? The flood is not because God is angry. God didn't send the flood because he got out of control.
No.
Well, but that's a very important point, right? As the next sentence is going to point out, anger is an imperfection. To imply that God gets angry at all.
So God can punish without anger.
Exactly. And so should we. In the cases where it's necessary for us to punish or rebuke, it should be done without anger as well. Learning from the ways of God.
Which is a wise thing to do, but very difficult.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But apparently there's remorse, because after the flood, didn't we hear God say, I'm not going to do that anymore?
So after the flood, we hear a statement of God that, if said by a human, would be described as remorse, and so the Torah speaks in the language of humanity and describes it as remorse in order that we can better relate and understand to the lesson that that story is giving us. But that doesn't mean you can read it up the chain, so to speak, to describe God's actual characteristics and nature. God doesn't change his mind. We sometimes need to perceive it in that way in order to begin to understand the implications at a basic level. But ultimately, through the study of Agadah, the final paragraph on the front half of the handout, we learn that God is not actually subject to those same types of emotional swings that humans are. It's just a helpful metaphor in some circumstances. Now, unfortunately, some of those helpful metaphors have overtaken many people's understanding of God. And that has become a problem, especially in the modern world. God is often characterized by a lot of the idioms and metaphors used as being wrathful and angry and all of these other things. And that's a shame, because not only is God not, but our tradition has not viewed God as having those emotions in the first place, but has only held them out as being an aid to our youngest spiritual development self, of getting us in the right frame of mind with something we can relate to, which is humanity and human emotions and human relationships. But we are supposed to get above that. We are supposed to graduate beyond it. Right? It's the same way if you are a kindergartner and the teacher keeps telling you that you have to say please and you have to say thank you. You have to say please and you have to say thank you. You may think that the kindergarten teacher is awfully dictatorial. Eventually you realize that it's not just the teacher wants you to say please and thank you, it's the teacher's trying to help you realize a higher ideal of understanding gratitude and of understanding appreciation and of how we interact with other humans. And then all of a sudden you realize it's not the teacher just being authoritarian, it's the teacher instructing you in something very, very important. If you're stuck in kindergarten mode your whole life, you'll probably think that teachers are pushy jerks for making you always say please and thank you, because you never understood the purpose of what they were doing when they were forcing you, I erased it, to obey. But that is up to us to reach that next level and then higher and higher and higher, rather than saying, well, you know what, I don't like this caricature, so the real thing must be wrong.
It's really critical to remember that Tavo is written in the language of man.
Exactly. There's a beautiful statement from the, I believe it's my first session on understanding God, that if the Torah had not been written with anthropomorphic language, if we had not talked about God being slow to anger and being quick to forgive, and of God's love and care and mercy and regret and hopes and all of these things, that the average person, when they first opened up the book, would go, I see nothing in here that I can relate to. This idea of this being that is completely different than me, I don't understand how I'm supposed to understand or connect to this. But instead, the Torah starts off with a common denominator, something that all of us can appreciate and understand, understanding that we will eventually rise above the literalness of the language. You know, my favorite example is the exact word that we're using here. The Hebrew for slow to anger is not slow to anger. It's erech hapayim. Anyone here remember their Hebrew lessons when they learned the word af? Einayim?
9, 5, nose.
They're off. It's your nose. Right? Erech hapayim means you got a long nose. God has a long nose. What is God? God has a long nose? Excuse me? What happens when you get angry? Your nose starts pulsing and your nostrils are flaring. Having a long nose means it takes a long time before your nose starts going like that. It's an idiom from biblical Hebrew, right? You got a patient nose there, right? That means you've got a long fuse. Does anyone think that just because they use the phrase erech hapayim, that God has a long nose, that the ancients believed God had a big nose somewhere that was just sitting there not getting all puffy? No, but they needed to use a metaphor that was similar and relatable to the average person. Because the Torah was written for the average person in order to make the average person a better person. And you don't start off by writing something that can only be understood by the people that are already better.
Correct.
You have to write something that can be at least somewhat understood by everyone starting no matter where they are. And the Torah was written in exactly that manner. Okay, got to finish this up.
Last paragraph.
Last paragraph. So what does this all mean for me?
Since most people are drawn after their desires and cravings, and many of them worship the sun, moon, I hope that's
Moon. Yeah, they worship the
moon, stars and idols. As a result, the world is constantly incurring destruction.
All right, so what do we mean when we say God is angry? Right, this is giving you an example of what it means to move to a slightly higher understanding. And what Sefer HaChinuch is saying is that, look, so many people around the world are doing horrible, horrible things as they follow their desires and their cravings and trample everyone else in the process. So many people are worshiping sun, moon, stars, idols, and all these other things. By definition, the world has incurred a debt that should be paid by its destruction. Right? The world with this type of typical behavior going on is not worthy in and of itself of continuing to spin. That's what he's trying to say here. And therefore, when the
Psalms and the sages say God's wrath is for an instant each day, it is because every single day, at the moment when one sinner completes the majority of his sin,
with his sin,
completes the majority with his sin, metaphorically, there is a blaze of anger and a judgment against humanity.
Okay.
At that instant.
Hold on. I gotta make sure we got the metaphor
At
here.
that instant.
I know, it's hold on to the instant. Okay? So every day, right? Every day there's a giant, let's call it net, right? That's under humanity in the world. And every day people begin with a fresh slate. And every day people begin to act. They begin to steal, they begin to murder, they begin to treat each other insultingly, they gossip, they are violating the honest trade laws. Every day people are doing all these things, and they begin to pile up. All the little transgressions and all the big transgressions begin to pile up, and the net begins to stray, right? That the weight of our transgressions accumulates. And at some point during the day, some person insults someone. Just that one extra thing, and that is breaking the net. That means that the majority of the people and the majority of the acts for that day has gone over the balance from good to bad, and you're now worthy of being wiped out. Does that mean God's mood changes at that moment? According to this. Does it mean God suddenly goes, Gah! Again, just, wiped up. No. What he's trying to say here is that instant when the world tips the balance and is worthy of destruction, that would be when we would call anger as an emotion for a human king or a human ruler when that happens. And we should recognize the severity of what happens each and every day when we push ourselves over the brink. And we can recognize the severity by metaphorizing it, if that's a word, as God being angry. But God's mood doesn't change, right? It's God's emotional state, if you could even use such a word, is like that the entire time. Before breaking, while it breaks, next day, God doesn't go up and down. God doesn't have highs and lows of anger and happiness and all of that. But what does this mean for us? When we think about it as though God gets angry, it's something we can relate to better, because for most of us, if we know that what we do doesn't affect the mood of others, we remove one of the biggest incentives we have for changing our behavior. If we think, they're not going to care whether I do it, then that's usually a good excuse why we end up doing it. And this is trying to give us the metaphor of anger as a way of saying, don't do it. Because if God wasn't God and was instead just super powerful, mighty Superman with a Star of David on his chest rather than an S, he might get angry. And so you shouldn't. It's instructional, it's not definitional.
Why do we hear the term a wrathful God?
It is meant to imply that God cares about what happens in the world, that what we do upsets the balance of the world. And well, go ahead and finish the sense, and then we'll come back to the overall implications of this. The instance, yeah.
That instant, according to strict justice, all deserve obliteration. Only the midah of mercy tips the scale and lets the world endure.
All right, so why do we talk about a wrathful God, and why do we talk about a merciful God? Because we are supposed to understand that the world is constantly in the balance every single day. And on one side you've got destruction, and on the other side you have redemption. And every single day we start adding up the side of the scale that's going to tip us to destruction. When we think of God metaphorically as caring about this process, about not wanting us to go towards destruction, it becomes incentive for us, especially when we realize what is hanging in the balance, and especially when we realize, as is mentioned in other parts of the Talmud, that it's one more thing that tips the balance, and that may be you or me or someone in China. It's one more person doing one more thing somewhere that's going to tip it. That becomes a psychological aid for me not to do my thing. Right, you want to be the one that breaks the camel's back? Do you really need to do that? Because that may be the one that tips us to obliteration. But on the other side of the scale, again, metaphorically, because it's not like God's emotion is going up and down, but helpfully for us, we know that God is constantly there with a thumb on the scale, kind of distorting the balance to make sure we're not obliterated, to make sure we don't destroy ourselves, to make sure the world doesn't end, despite us having worked really, really hard to achieve that destruction. That God is there to prevent that from happening. And that means we have hope, and we have a little more inspiration to do good as an expression of gratitude and as an expression of hope that maybe this next day, this won't be quite so full. Because we've been given another day. We've been given another chance. As Rosh Hashanah approaches, we've been given another year. Right? And every year God tells us, look, I'm wiping this away. Let's start again. Right? Now be careful, right? Because I'm going to hold you accountable. That's the whole metaphor of wrath. But also come back if you make mistakes, because I'm not so wrathful that I never forgive. These are metaphors to help us understand what is incomprehensible to the human. And they're useful metaphors if we use them as metaphors, but they can be divisive and they can be painful if we allow ourselves to hold them too literally. And it's walking between that, not going to the metaphor so much that we lose the inspiration, but not running away from the metaphor so much that we also lose the inspiration. And that's a difficult balance to strike. That's being in the middle. That's walking in God's ways. Okay, thank you very much.
Question.
Yes.
I have a question about attitude.
Let me just go ahead and hit the stop here, and then we can carry on. Stop.